our 1-year anniversary. So thank you everyone for your continued support. Tonight's speaker is Dr. Mary Shenk, who is Director of the Life Sciences and Society Program and a cultural anthropologist. She's a professor at the University of Missouri in the anthropology department, and just in time for Valentine's Day, we're going to have a talk about marriage and love in different cultures. So join me in welcoming Dr. Shenk.
It's good to be here tonight. I've actually only been here as a guest before, never as a speaker, so hopefully you'll be interested in what I have to say. So when I was asked to do this, I knew I was going to talk about marriage, but what exactly about marriage was a different question. And the title of tonight's talk, What is Marriage, was actually not by me, but by Jason Fenton, who organizes the event. So I am going to start by talking briefly about what marriage is in terms of a definition, and then I'm going to move on to talk more generally about marriage, how American society's form of marriage fits into cross-cultural norms about marriage. So marriage is, ironically, both a human universal, meaning something that exists in pretty much all human societies, and at the same time, something that's very hard to define. The reason why marriage is hard to define is because that it seems to fulfill different functions in different cultures. So for instance, in many cultures it serves to form a household based on the sexual division of labor of men and women who have different kinds of tasks. So men may be herding, women may be gardening or doing agriculture, and they're sharing, okay? So like I said, sometimes marriage is essentially formed from a sexual division of labor in a household, and that's one of its main functions in a society. But in other societies, sometimes that's performed by men and women who are brothers and sisters living in the same household instead. In other kinds of places, the main function of marriage seems to be that you essentially are connecting two families together. You're forming alliances between those kinds of families. In fact, a lot of people have argued that's the main function of marriage cross-culturally. That's true again in some societies, but not in all societies. You also have a lot of societies where marriage defines social relationships for children. So in other words, it tells you who your mother and father are, because sometimes those are not the genetic mother and father. It gives you other relatives to be related to as well. And it gives you the sense of social obligations that you have to all of those different people. So those are some different functions that marriage has in different societies. But in reality, almost none of these kinds of functions, and I could give you a list that's 2 or 3 times as long, is actually the same as other cultures. Some of those exist in some cultures and some of them exist in other cultures. So today I'm going to talk about 3 aspects of marriage and how we, as Americans, or more generally people in what anthropologists call Euro-American societies, fit into global norms on marriage. So the first thing I wanted to mention is the number of spouses people have. So Americans are, as you all know, typically, or at least by norms, monogamous. In technical terms, that means we only have one spouse at a time. Probably many of you have, in the course of your life, had more than one spouse. And probably others of you will have it later in your life more than one spouse. But having only one spouse at a time is usually how we define monogamy. And that's, of course, something that's legally enforced in many cultures, including our own. Now, interestingly, monogamy is both 2 things. It is the most common form of marriage cross-culturally in terms of the numbers of people in marriages, but it is not the most common ideal form of marriage cross-culturally. The most common ideal form of marriage cross-culturally is something else. Does anyone know what that might be? Yes, lots of wives, one husband, exactly. Something that anthropologists refer to as polygyny. Poly meaning many and gyny meaning women, right? I think a lot of people colloquially refer to it as polygamy, right? But anthropologists like to be more specific. Polygamy technically just means many marriages, and we want to specify who has many marriages. So instead we say polygyny, right? Many women, one husband, many women. in societies that have polygyny, most men may not be able to be married polygynously. Hold on. Drop my notes. However, most men aspire to it, and people with more wealth and status are usually able to have polygynous marriages, even though ordinary people may not be able to. So men may desire many wives because wives produce children, and in many cultures, more children is essentially more wealth or status or more laborers for your family. They may want many wives because in many cultures, wives do a lot of labor, both in terms of reproduction and production, farming, fishing, doing other things. And they also, wives are often in many cultures a marker of status. Women, on the other hand, in polygynous societies are often interested in having multiple wives with them, or they're willing to be one of multiple wives because, A, they're often married to wealthier husbands, which may mean more resources for them and their children. They also often want help with work around the house, so things like childcare or farming or taking care of animals often are easier if they're shared work. And they also might be interested in more status as well. So while monogamy is the most common in terms of numbers and polygyny is the most commonly preferred, one of the less common forms of marriage is something called polyandry. Can someone tell me what polyandry is? Yes? Multiple husbands, exactly. Always a perennial favorite of my students and other people. So polyandry, there are really two forms of polyandry. Depending on how you define it, it's found in about 4% of cultures worldwide or 1%. Again, depending on how you define it. The most common find by far is something called fraternal polyandry. Fraternal means what? Brothers, exactly. So fraternal polyandry means when a woman marries a group of brothers. So this is a common and in fact high status form of marriage in the Himalayas. So places like northern India and Tibet and Nepal and surrounding countries, some parts of China as well. There's another form of polyandry though which is less common, but it was more common in the past, but it's less common now. This is something which is often referred to as visiting husbands. So essentially what this means, so this is found in a couple of cultures in southwest China that still exist, and several cultures in South India and in Southeast Asia that are where it used to happen historically but doesn't really happen too much now. And essentially what this means is a situation in which women and men both stay in their natal household, that is a household that they're born into, and so they're sharing their cooperation or economic cooperation is with their brothers rather than their husbands or wives. And the children born to the women of the family stay in that family and grow up, and they stay there ideally their entire lives. But the husbands are, and this may be done symbolically or it may be unofficially, the men visit the women at night in their household, or they may have some other form of relationship. And so these are visiting husbands. People argue all the time about whether these count as husbands, but frequently there is a term meaning husband that is used in these societies. And so I would argue, and other people argue, that they do have husbands, though some people dispute that idea. And finally, I want to talk about the most rare and probably unusual form of marriage, and in many cases I expect even my students have not heard of it or really don't know how it works, and that is group marriage. So have any of you heard of group marriage outside of the 1960s? Okay. So traditional society form of group marriage usually occurs when people in frequently more of like a polyandrous society or a society that has very flexible marriage rules. So for instance, it could be a group where there's a woman married polyandrously to a group of brothers, and then the group of brothers decides to take another wife. That's one way you could get a group marriage, and you have 3 men and 2 women. Another way you could get this, as Peter Gardner, who's emeritus from my department, was just pointing out to me before the talk, is that you can have kind of a serial string of marriages where a woman is married to a man and then that man is married to another woman and then she might be attached to another man. So you can end up with multiple people, but they're not necessarily married to each other. And this is, both of these things are pretty uncommon in societies with polyandry, you do frequently see group marriages, at least for short periods of time, though often the family breaks up into two families after that. But this kind of serial string of group marriages happens again in societies with more informal forms of marriage, more ability at the individual level to define what marriage is. All right, the next topic I want to talk about is arranged marriage versus love marriage. As many of you are aware, though some of you, my students, are frequently surprised to hear this, Americans, as you know, prize love marriage, and most of my students assume that love marriage is the normal kind of human marriage, when in fact, it's by far the less common form of human marriages. Depending on how you defined arranged marriages, they characterize probably somewhere between 80 and 90% of all societies historically and cross-culturally, putting us distinctly in the minority with this idea of getting married for love. And I see a couple of you looking shocked back there. Okay, good. I'm glad it's new for some of you. All right. So arranged marriages are common, especially where marriage is tied to property or social obligations among kin groups or important alliances between families. Those are the main kinds of motivations. So in situations like this, marriages are typically seen as contracts between individuals, or even more specifically between families. And a bad decision about a marriage, or not liking your spouse and breaking up the marriage, would have a lot of negative repercussions, not just for you, but your siblings and your parents and other relatives of yours as well. So in most cultures, marriage has is important for these reasons, and therefore is at least in part arranged or at least heavily influenced by parents and others. Okay. Also, in a lot of traditional societies, people marry at young ages and are therefore not thought of as being kind of, how do you want to say it, mature enough to make good decisions about marital partners, and their parents are afraid that they're going to run off with someone just because they think they're really attractive and then make a really bad match and essentially end up with a broken marriage and a lot of problems for everyone involved. So it's also seen as something that's too important to put in the hands of the couple themselves. Love marriages, on the other hand, at least love marriages as we know them in the modern Euro-American setting, are a relatively recent phenomenon. Can someone give me about when we start thinking about love marriages as being a social norm or an emerging norm in the West? 1760. 1760. That's slightly on the early end, but that is where about the time it starts. I agree with that. So in the late 18th century and early 19th century is where you start to see the emergence of social norms that support love marriage as a kind of a cultural norm. And it doesn't even become a norm that most people actually are able to act on until probably the late 19th or early 20th centuries for most people, depending on your social class and a few other things. So love marriage is linked to something that's both called the romance complex, meaning a set of cultural norms focusing on romance or supporting romance between the couple, and also something called companionate marriage, which is the idea that marital partners should be companions to each other, which is definitely not a norm in a lot of cultures before that time, certainly within this part of the world. And these norms is focused on close emotional bonds between spouses. They argued that marriage should be emotionally fulfilling, and then later, especially in the 20th century, people kind of expanded that to argue that marriage should be sexually fulfilling. Also, people argued that parents should have close relationships with children, although later on that sort of developed a norm in which you should have a very close relationship with your children, though more recently in the 20th century a norm has developed that children are not necessary to a marriage in the way that they've typically been thought to be necessary in most cultures in the past. So the rise of love marriage is associated with a bunch of different social changes going on. So in some ways it's linked socially to the rise of industrialization and economic development, and the way in which then children were freed in some senses economically from their parents. Before then, If you were wealthy, the way you got wealth was to inherit wealth in the form of land from your parents, probably from your father if you were a man, and then some wealth through your mother if you were a woman, depending on the circumstances. But once you have a society in which education is a primary form of kind of earning wealth, children become increasingly independent of their parents and able to make their own wealth, and therefore they have a much more personal choice in who they decide to marry. And so the decreasing dependence on parents, also the breakup of the extended family into nuclear families, and associated with this a rising sense of personal choice, all come together to at least be part of what drives the change from arranged marriage to love marriage as a social norm. This then, love marriage as a norm then spreads from Europe to other parts of the world, or in fact, I would prefer to think of it as sort of reinvented in different parts of the world, again, often with these kinds of economic changes that are going on. All right, I'm going to talk about one more thing before I take questions, and that's the topic of same-sex marriage. As you know, Americans, and in this sort of Euro-American sphere that anthropologists like to talk about it, have traditionally had a norm of heterosexual marriage. Everyone knows that, but everyone also is aware that that's now changing, and that there is increasing interest in or acceptance of people being allowed to marry even if they have of the same sex. So there are, as many of you are aware, lots and lots of examples of same-sex marriage historically and cross-culturally, many of them in small-scale societies very different than our own, but some of them in societies that more closely resemble our own. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples here. These are very different kinds of examples. And one is same-sex marriage among Native North Americans. So one thing that's been written about extensively in the last few years is going back to missionaries and fur traders and trappers' diaries, looking for descriptions of Native American culture early on in the colonial period, right? So very early on, before you have a lot of contact with European settlers. And one thing that's noted over and over in some of these diaries or journals, etc., is first of all, people with non-traditional gender identities being much more common or able to be sort of out socially than in other parts of the world, and also the fact that many people with non-traditional gender identities may be married to members of what the Europeans saw as their own sex, or even people who were just two men or two women seemed to be able to have relationships with each other that were socially acknowledged and allowed and seem to be at least somewhat formalized. You see these kind of relationships in many parts of the world, but let me talk about an example that some of you may not know as much about, which gives an example of how diverse same-sex marriages are cross-culturally. And this is the example of woman marriage, or woman-woman marriage more technically, in Africa. Has anyone ever heard of this? Yes? People who are not teaching cultural anthropology at certain points? Okay. I don't know, maybe a few of you. Okay, so this is a practice in some parts of East and South and Central Africa, usually in societies where people are herders, but not entirely. It could be in people who are also practicing agriculture. These are societies that typically practice polygyny, so one man has multiple wives, and they often also practice bride price, in which, because women are so much in demand, the husband's family pays the wife's family at marriage, often over a period of years starting before and going after marriage. So in these kinds of cases, women, there are a few different examples, but one that's really common, there's about 50 or 60 societies that this has been described for. Older women who are postmenopausal, they may themselves be married to a man. They start to accumulate status or wealth themselves, and as a marker of their status and wealth, use some of their wealth to marry younger women as brides. They therefore, when they do this, acquire the labor of the younger women, which is one thing that gives you high status in societies where labor is the main way that you get any form of wealth or resources. But also, those younger women then can reproduce, maybe with a relative of the female husband, the older women, And she's then able, she acquires status, and the younger women, the children born to the younger women, also become part of the family of the female husband. If the female husband has a husband of her own, then they become part of the patrial line that she's married into. If the female husband is a woman who didn't have any brothers, and that was the motivation for this kind of marriage, then the children born to the female wives, usually younger women, belong to the patrial line, the father's patrial line of the woman who is the older, the sort of female husband in the marriage. Okay. All right. Few things. One, I want to point out a few things. One, and that is that same-sex marriages in other cultures, while they exist in many cultures, are not necessarily similar to ideas of same-sex marriage that are emerging in our own culture. And there are few ways in which they're clearly different, not in all cases, but in some cases. One is that they sometimes, though not always, involve people of different genders. So while two people may be male in a technical sense, they won't both identify as men, right? Although in other cases, people do marry members of their same gender. In other cases, these examples of same-sex marriage take place in contexts where it's clearly not about love or even about sex. And in some cases, they're actually arranged, as in the example of woman-woman marriage. So some of this diversity is really quite different. So same-sex marriage itself is a very diverse category to begin with. However, there is a way, however, same-sex marriages in modern American society are very consistent with the logic of love marriages that I just discussed a little while ago. So for instance, they're often the ideology of marriage and the most effective arguments for same-sex marriage that are made in this culture usually revolve around a focus on love and companionship, the right to marry who you love, to live with who you love, the emphasis on personal choice, that you should have the choice to live with the person, again, that you love. Also, may be aided by a decreasing emphasis on children as being necessary to marriage, even in heterosexual marriage. While many people still want children and think they're important, most people don't think that your marriage is less of a marriage because you don't have children, though that may have been the case sometimes in the past. And I would argue that our transition to love marriage is one of the key drivers of increasing acceptance of same-sex marriage in modern America and related societies. And I'll go ahead and take questions now. Thanks.
I was just wondering if you could kind of just tell a timeline. You know, that there's been kind of a gradual change, like you said, from arranged marriage to love matches and, you know, like that. If we're seeing a lot more acceptance now of homosexual marriages, same-sex marriages in our society, and I wonder if that follows along kind of the timeline that you see for changes throughout history of how marriage is considered.
Lots of parts of the world have their own timelines. And I actually work in South Asia, so that's India and Bangladesh, so I actually know that timeline more. And same-sex marriage is not really accepted there, only maybe very, very beginning, right? Even though there were a lot of people who had different gender identities, who had maybe same-sex marriages in the past, but those may or may not have been recognized socially. They have not been recognized socially in the last couple of hundred years. But that may be in part because of colonialism. They may have been more recognized before British colonial period. So in this sort of Western cultures, and I'm using that as a reference because most people know what's going on there, and I'm trying to compare that to other things. This is interesting. So as I said, arranged marriage is a norm for a lot of people up until the late 18th or early 19th century, so the late 1700s, early 1800s. And then you start to see at that point, the emphasis is on love marriage, but it's still very much focused around heterosexual marriage, and there's still a really strong emphasis on children for many people. And really it starts, I think, in the 20th century, You get more of an emphasis even on sexual satisfaction. You get less of an emphasis on children slowly over time. Some of these things go back to the 20s, but they're not really widespread. The other thing that you start to see that during this period that I didn't mention is a greater acceptance of divorce, right? That it's legitimate, that maybe divorce isn't good, but that it's legitimate to get a divorce if you're unhappy in your marriage, whereas before that would have been highly stigmatized, even when it was legal, and it was very, very difficult to get a divorce in, say, the late 18th century, early 19th century, right? So people would often, if they hated each other, where they would try to live separately or something, but they often weren't able to. So just over that time, you have an increasing emphasis on love and companionship and choice. And so it kind of slowly happens. I mean, the greater acceptance of same-sex marriage has happened definitely in my lifetime. You start to see widespread social acceptance of homosexuality probably in the 90s, and probably this growing. But when I was in college in the early 90s, we used to talk about what was going to happen next, big social innovations. And we all thought that marijuana was going to be legal long before same-sex marriage was legal. And that was wrong, right? It's absolutely the opposite. And I think that one of the arguments, although you can see the marijuana stuff has begun as well. And I think one of the reasons is that even among young, fairly conservative evangelical people, the argument, this sort of very, very strong social tie between love and marriage, it's so strong and so culturally important that it seems to trump for a lot of people other kinds of arguments. And I've seen that happen again within my lifetime. I've seen enormous change, and I also read a lot of things about same-sex marriage advocates finding that absolutely the most convincing thing that they can say is not the kind of libertarian argument that we all should have equal rights, that the government shouldn't regulate this and we should all have equal rights. But the absolutely most convincing thing that they can say is that don't we all have the right to love who we want to and marry who we want to? And I think that idea of choice is so strongly tied up in marriage that you see this. And in fact, I'm not by far the only person to make this argument. It's been made by others as well.
Two questions. When did consent, especially of the woman, become part of this? And does marriage, when did ceremony become part of it to make it more than just like pair bonding or living together and become a marriage? When did that all
These are both really good questions. So the idea of female consent in marriage, and specifically female consent in marriage, because if anyone's not consulted in a marriage, it's the woman getting married. So, I mean, there's examples of this going way, way, way back. I mean, in ancient Rome, women frequently didn't have to give consent at first, but then later there are examples where they do. In the Quran actually was a rather radical revisioning of women's rights at the time, because it actually says that women need to give consent in marriage, which was a change from some things that had been happening in that part of the world before then. So actually, women's consent in marriage, it depends on where you are in the world. In some cases, it's really, it's been hundreds or thousands of years, and in other places it hasn't been. In some places, it's gone in and out of fashion. So a lot of times, women had to have the consent of their guardian to marry until they were 21. I mean, actually that's still true for both men and women, or boys and girls, if you want to say that, until most people are 18, or it can be a little bit younger in some states in the US. But I'm just thinking about in England, the last couple of centuries, probably I don't know exactly when it ended, but certainly in the 18th century and the early 19th century, you didn't have the right to marry until you were 21. But at 21, you had the right to marry without the permission of your guardians. And a lot of women, of course, were married before that age, and so they had to marry with permission, or they had to run away to Scotland, where you could marry earlier and without parental consent. So this is actually, it's a patchwork all over the world, different times, places where you have parental consent. And the second thing you asked me, or not parental consent, where you have women's consent. Yeah. And right now, well, I'll go into that maybe later, but you asked about ceremony. This is actually an interesting question. So there are very few societies that don't have some ceremony about marriage. So did the Polyan have a marriage ceremony or not, Peter? Okay, I can't hear. Most people don't. Okay, so ceremony seems to be a little bit more about whether related, at least in what I've seen, related more to how much social stratification there is in a society. So if you're talking about hunter-gatherers, so hunter-gatherers have, in many ways, very, very little social hierarchy, less social hierarchy than any other kinds of human societies. But still, most first marriages are arranged, especially for women who marry as teenagers, as most women married as teenagers in the history of the world until the 20th century. And except in Europe, where you are waiting until you're 25 or 30 or 35 to inherit land from your parents. But so a lot in times in hunter-gatherer groups, you don't have much ceremony. And in horticultural groups, the ceremony, there is a little bit of ceremony, but anytime you start to get significant wealth differences or you start to get a lot of property transferred at marriage, you start to see ceremonies of different kinds. So that's actually, I mean, that's probably really, really old. I mean, how long have we had domesticated cattle? How long have we had agriculture? I mean, these things go back at least 10,000 years, so my guess is we probably have marriage ceremonies at that time. But that's one thing that you don't really know for sure because it goes back farther than we have written records, and so it's very difficult to tell exactly when we get ceremonies.
When did there become like a strong tie between religion and marriage? Is that like a popular concept throughout the world, or is that just something that we see mainly here in the West?
So certainly in modern societies, there are people who have disentangled marriage from religion, but it's not at all uncommon to have marriage have religious aspects to it. It's actually quite common cross-culturally. I wouldn't say, I'm trying to think of examples where there's not really something religious tied up in marriage. Maybe in some really small scale societies you have that. Peter's nodding, that means I'm right, he works with hunter-gatherers, where you don't really see a lot of, the religion is about other things, not specifically about marriage. You also have some groups in which marriage is really seen more as a transaction than anything else. So ancient Rome, for instance, or maybe some of the other ancient world states where it's really seen as a contract between husbands and wives and each person has to fulfill their part of the contract and you can divorce if these things aren't fulfilled. So there are a lot of examples like that, but on the other hand, there's lots of examples where marriage is tied up with religion. So marriage is heavily tied up with religion in Hinduism. It's tied up with religion in Christianity, although some people argue it's more tied up in that it became more tied up than it was in the past. In other words, there became more ceremonies. I'm trying to think of other examples from other parts of the world that would help out here. Certainly, there's a lot of rituals surrounding marriage in a lot of the African cultures that I'm familiar with, right? And so, and at least some of that is religious in nature, though all of it may not be religious in nature. So we have a lot of religious aspects of marriage, but we also have a lot of secular customs tied up in marriage. And so that's actually pretty common. Though I agree, I mean, I would say it's not universal that the two are necessarily collective, but it's quite common. Although, I mean, I would also give the example that modern marriages in modern Europe are often quite secular. And of course, you have a lot of secular marriages that happen in this culture as well, right? But that's a fairly recent development. But you did have people...
They're not marrying European Americans, but other Asians, for example.
Okay.
And then, second part of that, how did they decide what second language is, second culture they're going to teach their children?
Okay, this is an interesting question. I'm going to answer it fairly broadly. So, all over the world, so economic development we talked about, or industrialization, does a bunch of things to marriage and the family, and I've given you a short list, right? There's actually quite a long list of things that it does that happen, that seem to happen over time in a lot of places when when they experience industrialization. And one thing that emerges from choice in marriage is often greater willingness to marry outside of one's social group. So the traditional anthropological term is endogamy. You marry in a social group. So most people have, you know, caste endogamy, class endogamy, racial endogamy, religious endogamy. People have those things, but in a context where you have more choice in marriage, a lot of those things seem to slowly break down. A lot of people, even with choice, still marry someone who's like them, but some people start to be more willing to marry outside of those groups, right? And so, for instance, where I do research in India, you get much more inter-caste marriage than you did in the past, people marrying someone from a different caste group. And sometimes they're very, you know, modern families and their parents don't care about caste, but sometimes their parents are really not happy about this at all and they get kicked out of the family, at least until the first child is born. That often seems to heal the problems, at least in that part of the world. It's a stereotype, it's actually quite true. So you see a lot greater likelihood of marrying outside of groups. One of the things that's true about arranged marriage is that one of the major motivations in arranged marriages is to maintain the social class status of the family or give you social connections that are going to be helpful to you. And those are often people at the same status level. So unless your father is trying to marry you from the Medici into the Strozzi, in these Italian Renaissance families, in order to make an alliance, but you're still at the same class level, but you may be married to a different city or something, when the importance of those kind of social, when your dependence on your parents decreases and the importance of those kinds of alliances breaks down, people get a lot more choice and they're a lot more willing to marry across groups. And so I see people in India where I do research more likely to marry outside of their social class, or more likely to marry outside the region that they come from. So maybe they come from Tamil Nadu in South India, and they will marry someone who's from West Bengal, from Calcutta, right? You see some of that. You see people coming to the U.S. and frequently, you know, end up marrying someone from a different community in the U.S., and it could be someone who has a European background, or it could be someone who is from a completely different part of the world. So you start to see that. In terms of how people choose to raise their children when they have two different backgrounds, there is a literature on this, and it's slightly outside my area, so I don't know it that well. But I can say from personal experience watching people do this, a lot of times they try to raise them in both, or they might choose one in the case where one of their families has kind of cut them off, right? So if they perceive with one of their traditions as, or one of their families as more accepting, they may choose to raise that child in that. But frequently I see people I know who have some kind of mixed marriage of some kind, right? It could be Christian, Jewish mixed marriage, it could be Hindu, Muslim, it could be something else. They often are interested in getting a little bit of both. But again, there's research on that I don't know all the details of.
So help me wrap my mind around something I'm having trouble with, and it may be based on a false assumption. Has marriage and the concept of marriage come about because we've evolved to support it? In other words, did it offer some type of survival advantage to people who entered into those kind of contracts? And if that's the case, are we evolving away from it? I mean, you mentioned that in the last part of this century that people were moving away from maybe traditional marriage and moving away from children in traditional marriage. And to me, that would seem to be a genetic disadvantage as far as survival is concerned.
Are you done? Should I go? Okay. So I would argue yes. I mean, I am an evolutionary cultural anthropologist. I do think that there are certain adaptive advantages to marriage, but it's a complex thing because most cultures, marriage doesn't serve exactly the same role. So I think it's like most cultural norms, there's some kind of functional advantage. So some of the things that we talked about at the very, very beginning of my talk about the function of marriage are probably some of the most persuasive arguments for adaptive advantages of marriages, or why the custom would arise and why it would be socially sustained. And so one example is this sort of sexual division of labor, and how it makes sense to put, this formalizes putting men and women into a household together where you have people with these different skills. A thing that's been argued very persuasively by a primatologist, anthropologist Bernard Chappé, is that the social alliances in marriage, or essentially the ability to make alliances between different kinds of kin, so that in other words, in a lot of non-human primates, you only recognize your mother and your siblings because your father may be in the group, but you have no way of knowing which person, which chimpanzee he was, right? But as we become human, one of the things that happens is you can formally recognize, when you can formally recognize that male who has been with your mother and your mother has a durable relationship with him over time, that connects you not just to your matrilineal family or the family you're related to maternally, but it connects you to a whole other group of people that you're related to paternally. So that's another argument that he's made, I think, very persuasively in a book called Primeval Kinship and in some other places about a function that one of the functions that mating, long-term mating bonds, eventually becoming marriage may serve is to create and perpetuate social relationships that people use in a lot of ways to help them out in life. So I'm just going to go to the other end of your question, sort of the other end of our history, if you want to call it that, and is marriage going away? This is an interesting question. People have been saying that marriage is going away for a long time, saying that various things are going to spell the end of marriage. Hasn't happened so far. You do see a shift in Northern Europe away from formal marriage and towards cohabitation, but it's a kind of cohabitation that for many people is similar to marriage in the sense that you have people living together for long periods of time and having children together and kind of having a shared life. On the other hand, there are a few things that do suggest marriage may be going away, although I'm not sure how good this evidence is. So one of them is a rise of single parent families, especially single mother families, where women either choose not to marry or can't marry for some reason. And this tends to be, if you look at the statistics, this tends to be related to places where either there aren't a lot of men in the population or where there's a lot of poverty. And so there's a question about whether or not that sort of means that marriage is going away, or whether that means you're in a situation where marriage is difficult, but if you could have a marriage, you actually would. And a lot of people, some people have done interviews with women who are single mothers in sort of very poor neighborhoods, and they argue, I don't need a man, men aren't reliable, all these other things, but then they sort of argue also that they would be interested if they felt like they were in a situation to get married, that they'd be interested in it. There's also another kind of critique of the family or critique of marriage going on, and that is people choosing not to marry intentionally for sometimes religious reasons, sometimes not really religious reasons, but kind of an objection to the religious aspects of marriage, or in a sort of embracing more secular values of some kind. So one of the kinds of critiques of the family comes from a sort of a, I would say, at least at this point in time, fringe social movement called polyamory, in which people make an argument that you should be able to marry as many people as you want, and you should be able to have different kinds of relationships with different people. They really strongly emphasize this idea of choice, and that you should have choice in all aspects of your relationships, and this is a little bit more tied historically to like the group marriage movement in the 60s, etc. But their argument is not so much that you shouldn't have marriage, but that you should have a variety of different configurations should be available and socially allowable. I don't know. Personally, I think marriage is a very, very durable human institution. If you can hardly find any societies without marriage in the history of the world, it's a little bit difficult for me to imagine it's going away really soon, though I absolutely do agree with you that there is probably going to be a growing number of people who who find alternative forms of marriage or maybe reinvent marriage in new ways, opposed to cross-cousin marriages? This is an interesting question. You asked this question, I assume, because you're aware that cross-cousin marriages are the most common form of preferred marriages in the world, right? It's very, very common cross-culturally for people to see their cross-cousin, that is either their mother's brother's daughter or their father's sister's son, as an ideal marriage partner. Well, I think this has to do with the fact that we have bilateral kinship instead of lineal kinship. So lineal kinship, so matrilineal kinship or patriline, where you inherit kinship through the mother or through the father, gives everyone in the society an unambiguous lineage that you're a part of, right? So it kind of creates a group that's very unambiguously defined, right? And that helps you if you're competing with people over land or competing with people over cattle, or maybe you're trying to cooperate in fishing or something like that. Lineage systems have a lot of advantages in social cooperation and also in social competition. However, we have a bilateral social system, which means that we see ourselves as equally descended from our mothers and fathers. And instead of having a lineage, which is just all the relatives that are related through your father to sons, to son to son, we have something that's called a kindred, where we are at the center of the kindred, and basically we're related to a whole bunch of people, and our relatives are defined by a bunch of people related to us, with ego or us as the center of the relationship. So I would argue, just from lots of stuff I've read and seen, etc., that in bilateral kinship systems, lineage systems are far more common than bilateral kinship systems. If I were going to go on for 2 hours, I would talk about bilateral kinship and how that we're also weird because we have bilateral kinship, because who else has bilateral kinship? Hunter-gatherers, right? I mean, it's very unusual in the sense that a lot of big agricultural societies that we're descended from had lineage systems. But without a lineage system, cross-cousin marriage isn't so useful, because cross-cousin marriage, like a lot of kinds of cousin marriage, serve to connect two lineages through marriage or keep them connected over time. And without a lineage, another lineage to connect to, it doesn't matter as much who you marry in terms of cousins. Though I will say that it was socially acceptable to marry your cousin in many parts of Europe up until, up through the 19th century, and actually in some parts of the US as well, especially the American South, into the 19th century. And that's all broken down in the late 19th and early 20th century. And now we have this giant taboo against cousin marriage, even though that also makes us very odd cross-culturally to have such a strong taboo against cousin marriage, which is quite common. So actually, this is, if you bring up cousin marriage at all, I always get this question. This is the answer to the question. It is true that there are genetic risks to marrying your cousin, primarily from recessive alleles. You get the same allele together and you have these diseases which would otherwise not manifest that manifest, right? However, the best evidence, as of a big paper by Biddles and Black in 2010, which is a meta-analysis of a whole bunch of different societies where they look at what's called excess mortality, or the extra mortality to children, infants and children, that you would expect compared to between an unrelated couple and cousin marriage, first cousin marriage, suggests that you have about 3% to 4% excess mortality. So that is, out of 100 children, 3 or 4 more might die maybe, right? And that's probably that in some cases may overestimate things. What?
That's only mortality.
That's only mortality, it's true. It's only mortality. So this is the argument, so it's only mortality, but their argument is that's essentially about the excess mortality that a lot of people have argued that you would get for women having children in their 40s, which is a common thing. Oh, they're talking about him being crazy. Okay, exactly, yeah. So it is true that there are some risks. The mortality risks are as I was saying, relatively, comparatively low. And in a lot of cultures, if it's socially very important for you to marry your cousin, because you really need an alliance to that other group, or this is going to ensure your inheritance or something like that, this is going to basically just swamp any negatives. You also have fairly high fertility societies. People have a lot of children, and so then a lot of children die anyway from other kinds of things, so they're not too worried. On the other hand, if you're talking about them being crazy or them being sick for other reasons, it's true that there are those kind of risks, and they may be elevated. But again, the articles I've read suggest that yes, there is a risk, but it's not as high as a lot of people argued that it was in the past. This is at least the stuff that I've seen. And that you may be willing to pay the penalty or take the risk if it's advantageous enough to. Exactly. In this society, of course, people have dismissed that, right? It's a very strong social norm to not marry your cousin. And it's in fact the law in many, many states in America, though not all states in America. In some states, it's only illegal to marry double first cousins, where you're related through both sides.
I know we have a higher and higher percentage of divorce in our society. How long have we had society throughout the world, and how long have we had divorce throughout the world, and has it been more acceptable in other places that we're not aware of, or are we kind of like leading the pack on divorce? It seems like it's awfully high.
Okay, so is it working? Okay. So current figures that I've seen on divorce in the US, they kind of climbed up to around 50%, and then they've kind of tapered off. So they're not rising any longer, and they may have dropped a little bit, not radically. And some people have argued maybe they've dropped because some people chose not to get married, as the guy was suggesting in the back, right? So basically, they've gone up to about 50%, and then they've kind of tapered off a little bit, but they basically stayed around there. That is definitely a high rate of divorce. It's certainly a high rate of divorce. If you compare it to the recent history in Europe and America, where divorce was much more expensive and difficult to get and highly stigmatized, and people were really reluctant to get divorces. And I'll give you an example where I work in India. The current divorce rates are less than 5% in many places. And where I work in Bangladesh, which is a Muslim country and has a bit more acceptance of divorce because there are provisions for divorce in the Quran and in Sharia law and practice. The divorce rates are more like 10%. And most of those occur before people have children. So we do have pretty high divorce rates. On the other hand, you do have a lot of societies, especially small-scale societies, hunter-gatherer, tribal societies where they do sort of forager horticulturalists, in which marriage is basically just a little bit less formal, right? And where it's not uncommon for people to get divorced and remarried, maybe even multiple times in their lifetime, without having a lot of stigma or penalty against that. So in that sense, if you think compares to those kinds of small-scale societies, we're not that unusual. However, we have a lot more flexibility in our marriage system than a lot of the societies that restrict divorce so strongly. So in that sense, we're not that high, but we are really high compared to these big agrarian state societies that we kind of, that our sort of ancestors came from most recently, where they tend to, where property is strongly tied up in marriage, and there are big stigmas against divorce because it breaks up property and inheritance rules. There's some other things going on there, including religious ideologies, but where there's a strong function in people staying married and keeping the inheritance within families. That's less important, we have more choice, and so divorce, I think, is one consequence of that. But we're not unique. Yeah.
Well, thanks, Dr. Shenk, for joining us today.
What?
Thank you so much.
No problem. Thanks, everyone.